Hello, Void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and I recommend grabbing a snack because this is going to be a long one. I've been working on this for weeks, taking notes after every episode, so it's going to be excessively detailed in ways I try to cut down, but I'm apologizing in advance for the timestamp, just throwing it out there. Also, I love to read reactions and reviews and hot takes after everything I watch, but I tried to turn it down, so this is mostly just my unadulterated thoughts. However, I did listen to a couple podcast episodes, read a couple Twitter threads. I'll try to put everything up on the screen that I am mentioning. Lastly, I'm going to provide a timestamp for when I start ranking the episodes if you just want to sip to that, but I want to start with unpacking the show as a whole, especially because I think this helps explain my ranking. Going into this, I do want to speak to the idea of social commentary through media, making it more difficult to critique a piece of media. I'm grappling with this gap between knowing that not everyone is starting at the same point, so there is a value and need for racial theory 101 type media, so to speak, and also knowing that many shows like Lovecraft Country aren't actually that radical or going to meet me where I need. Once you peel back the special effects, most of the messaging isn't truly the wildest you could get. And this has been a theme with several movies and shows since 2015 of being presented as really pushing the envelope when in reality it's pretty tame or even harmful. I think it can be detrimental when we frame storytelling that centers marginalized communities as groundbreaking in terms of what's being conveyed, when what's groundbreaking is being provided the space to convey it. People have been telling these stories, they just haven't been given the resources to, put them on a bigger platform. More so, we focus so much on the idea of showing XYZ that we don't look as much at how the storytelling was actually done. If anything, we should be pushing for these types of stories to be digested just as they are instead of getting tripped up in the newness of them. For non-Black audiences, and more so non-Black gatekeepers, that very much means not looking at shows like Lovecraft Country as a novelty, but rather as a viewpoint that you just aren't cognizant of, but should still be able to relate to and or be interested by. For Black audiences, we have these two extremes of being hypercritical or hyper-supportive of content made by Black creatives, especially if said content has some form of social commentary in it. That being said, I'm working through my own hangups as I just laid out, and I want to push you, listener, to do the same. I don't want us to feel that because this show, made by and with Black people, speaks to portions of the Black experience we so rarely see in media, that it means the show as a whole is impervious to criticism, or that it should be run ragged. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's start with some positives. The cast of this show cannot be praised enough. Week after week, we were tuning in for a performance, okay? They were giving you acting. Juilliard. Wonderful. Also, beautiful gowns. And I don't mean that in a shady way. The wardrobe of this show is genuinely stunning. Even the men's fashion, which is usually the most stagnant thing in period dramas, was interesting to me. But I was specifically drawn to Ruby and Dee's outfits. It felt like learning history through the clothing because I was seeing people in shorts, which I wasn't thinking like women wore before the 60s, or seeing little girls' clothing. That was cool. Speaking of the visuals, the horror and the gore of this show are really well done. The special effects may wobble, but the fake blood stays viscous, okay? I feel like in general, when this show leans into a genre for an episode, it does so very well. The horror of episode 8, the sci-fi of episode 7, they were hitting all the tropes. It was great. I also typically enjoyed the voiceover quotes. I don't always think the timing made sense, but I like the idea, and the quote character combinations that they chose were really well done. Okay, is that everything? Right, cool. Now, moving on to this criticism. Speaking of supplementary audio with the voiceover quotes, the music selection, no, it's not always good, love. My thing is, I don't know where this show falls on the spectrum of campy genre television. When I was watching, I compared it a lot to The Witcher in terms of how both shows formatted time, given that they are both based off of books that are formatted like anthologies or short story collections. But The Witcher never breaks form to do something like have contemporary music. At the other end of the spectrum is a show like What We Do in the Shadows or Winona Earp, which is aware of its campiness and leans into it. I'm not sure where Lovecraft Country is trying to fall on that spectrum, and to me, the music sticks out as something that could very much be intentionally campy, but I think we're supposed to view it as like an edgy stylistic choice. Sometimes it was just corny, and not in a good or purposeful way. It was just like, why are you playing Bodak Yellow right now? Music selection isn't just about the lyrics, about using a song for one specific line, but also about the connotation you have or grow to have with that song. So when you see Christina driving and Rihanna is playing in the background, or you see Ruby in the department store and Lay Kelly 47 or Cardi B are playing in the background, what connotations do you have with these songs that the show is now asking you to transplant onto what the character is doing, or who we know this character to be? And how does it not fit? I also do want to point out the music selection in comparison to the voiceover quotes, because we don't get either one of these things in every episode, and yet the quotes, when they appear, fit better because they tend to fit within the theme of that episode and the show as a whole. While there is Naomi Waldler's speech and Sonia Sanchez's poem, most of the voiceovers are by people who were speaking in that era. That's not to say that the creators needed to only fold in music from the 50s, though I do think the song that plays when Dee's curse is kicking in is an excellent choice, and it still haunts me to this day. Rather, this is to point out that the contemporary songs have to work even harder to not feel out of place, and they often fail at that, instead feeling inconsistent to theme, whereas the more modern quotes don't. Inconsistency occurs quite a bit in the show over the season. In a show that's deliberate with small details and in planting tidbits for long-term payout, it doesn't make sense that you didn't realize that the map had the incorrect state for the location of the observatory. And that's no shade, but rather to point out that the details only seem to matter when the writers want them to. And while the map is a small and petty detail, I think we do see this expand into characters and plot lines. Letty's reintroduction to Tick in the pilot versus the softness and prolonged longing in the second episode, Letty's birth order among her siblings, or her whole relationship with Ruby and their childhood in general felt vague and inconsistent, particularly in the beginning of the season. In my mid-season review, I mentioned that Montrose's lie in episode 4 made me question what parts of his background we were supposed to believe for that episode. And given that Tick's parents both being from Tulsa would wound up being very important, wobbly info drops made some of the long-term payouts feel more disjointed. We can also see inconsistency with accountability and apology. Letty, Hippolyta, and alternate universe Uncle George are the only people held accountable for acting selfishly before they are forgiven. Montrose and Tick are just handed forgiveness to them without that extra step, and it makes characters we're supposed to perceive as complex just unlikable. Well, I don't think Montrose is that complex. I think he's just a vehicle for trauma, and that Tick, maybe in an effort for the show to not make him the prototypical focus, remains a pretty stagnant lone wolf character for the entirety of the season. But Letty ain't that well-rounded either, and Uncle George dies, so it's not like the characters who are held accountable are better written or have more screen time or post-episode podcast focus devoted to them. So why is it we can see Letty and Hippolyta and Uncle George held accountable but not Tick and Montrose, especially given that we watch them murder two people on screen? This connects a little to the next point, but I think there is this tendency for us to be shown things just for the shock and awe, with little follow-up on how that impacts that character's development or our understanding of them over time. If you can show us the trauma, you can show us the healing. And if you can't, if you only have time to flesh out one on screen and you choose to spend that time showing traumatic shit, that's not good storytelling to me. Which brings me to the violence of the show and the idea of purposeful violence, which I mentioned in my mid-season review. There are bad people who we aren't that upset to see die. When the Black Shoggoth eats up all the cops in episode 8, you aren't sad about that. If anything, you're relieved because that act protects Atticus. And there are many moments like that, usually with cops, where the violence is necessary in order to protect our protagonists. But there's some violence, Ruby's scene with the manager in episode 5, Gia's scene where she first sees Atticus in episode 6, Montrose rewatching Thomas get murdered in episode 9, which is, interestingly enough, very similar to Gia's scene, but with more focus on the person who survives as opposed to a wide shot that shows the audience more of the death. But anyway, some scenes feel like gratuitous violence for no reason. I have a lot of feelings about Montrose, and so even though I don't like it, I understand why that scene was placed in episode 9, why that whole mini story arc was added. But other than that, and arguably even including episode 9, I don't think this show does a good job with helping the audience or the characters heal from most of the violence we see on screen. The most glaring example of this is, of course, Yahima's death at the end of episode 4. Misha Green tweeted out that the choice at the end of episode 4 was to show that the oppressed can also be the oppressor. Beyond having a plethora of ways to show that don't include murdering somebody, it's a weak-ass reason because the rest of the season is spent building sympathy for Montrose, providing explanation to his behavior, which, if anything, if we're supposed to be processing Montrose as an oppressor from that action forward, is encouraging us to sympathize with oppressors. And that doesn't match up to the weekly racist bloodbath. If we're not supposed to be processing Montrose as an oppressed oppressor for the rest of his redemption arc, why have him kill somebody? It just doesn't make sense. It's a scene meant to shock us, just to shock us, and there's no consideration of how that impacts plot, character development, or the audience, you know? I think this has kind of been evident in every point except for the music selection. But my biggest gripe about this show is the writing. I want to note that it is easy to confuse good acting with good writing. There's a reason why Zendaya is an Emmy winner and Euphoria wasn't even nominated, okay? I've seen a lot of criticisms of the show that are just rooted in people not enjoying genre television, people seeing the weirdness as a con, but that's the structure of the show, and that's not my issue with it. I saw a tweet by Stitch Media, I think, or she was retweeting somebody else. I don't know, I can't find. But somebody said that a lot of people finding issue with the structure of the show probably just tuned in because they wanted to see Black people, but didn't factor in if this was the kind of show they'd be interested in otherwise. I think this is actually a good problem to have. If anything, I want there to be more stories with Black people in genres and roles that we aren't used to seeing ourselves in, to introduce people to a wider range of stories. It kind of goes back to the pilot episode when Tick is describing the Princess of Mars and the woman from the bus is surprised that the hero was a Confederate soldier. Who the protagonists are can limit our entry into entire genres just out of our own caution or disgust. So I think it is a good problem to have more people being exposed to new genres and building interest, or not, from exposure that they might not have considered otherwise because they get to see different protagonists. And, like I mentioned before, when the show leans into a genre for an episode, they do so very well. I think episodes 7 through 9 are a really great example of the exploration of genre that the show could have had more of. Those 3 feel more in line with anthology-form storytelling that mirrors the source material. But the issue throughout episodes is in building consistency with characters even as their weekly conflicts vary in structure. In comparison, I think the first 3 episodes do a better job of building up characters, though they play with structure and genre less. What we have is a show that can do one or the other, but not both at the same time. And regardless of structure, the show is supposed to have a plot and character development, and that's where shit gets rough. I think I need to do a whole separate video cast on how characters are developed in this show, but the long and the short of it is not very well, sis. Not very well. After episode 6, which I think got the most complaints about structure of the show, I started to be more invested in who was actually writing each episode. Misha Green is the showrunner and is billed on every episode, but starting with episode 4, take a shot every time I say episode, there's at least one co-lead writer who isn't the same week to week. And knowing this was really helpful in understanding how character development could be inconsistent over the whole season and in anticipating how characters would show up based on who was running the episode. When I was writing this, I made a prediction that, based off of the writers, episode 9 would feature one, if not all, of the 4 following things: Ruby and Christina / William's sexual tension, exploration of Montrose's sexuality, limited scenes with Tick and Letty together, and unnecessary hip-hop music. I got 3 out of 4 correct, and I based my prediction off of how episode 5 was structured. That shouldn't be so obvious. As for plot, I'm going to get into that a bit more by episode, which brings us to the episode ranking. We're starting from the bottom because I believe in ending on a high note. So, coming in at number 10 is episode 4, A History of Violence. I've complained about this before, and I'll do it again, but the choice to kill Yahima was shit. It wasn't innovative, creative, or new, and it's definitely a major reason why this is the worst episode in my opinion. However, beyond this, A History of Violence is the first we see Montrose's sexuality questioned. There's a scene in episode 2 when he's talking with George about why he stopped drawing, but despite what Macklemore said, drawing in the 3rd grade doesn't make you gay. Given that a lot of other stuff is going on and the person who tells Tick is a known liar, I get why Tick has a lackluster response, but I also don't understand why this is how we're introduced to Montrose potentially being gay. It feels like Montrose's sexuality is constantly something for Tick and the viewer to react to, as opposed to being a part of his character that's introduced just as seamlessly as Tick's love for Pulp Fiction or Letty's flighty relationship with her siblings. It's not Montrose or an interaction with Montrose that reveals his interest in men, but Tree, and then we're banking on Tick's reaction to know how to proceed. I think this scene in the museum sets up Montrose's trajectory as a flat character meant to send a message, as opposed to being a rounded participant in the story. We also get this in the episode's dialogue, which is some of the most poorly written in the show, though I will say episode 9 returns us to this more clunkily written dialogue from Montrose, so a point of consistency for that. The last thing I'll say about this episode that kind of points to a major plot issue within the whole show is that we're led to believe that Montrose knows a lot about the Sons of Adam. Beyond his own research, there are the bylaws that, of our living protagonists, Montrose is the only one who was able to read, but that only proves to be valuable for this episode, and at times he behaves like he doesn't know about magic at all, which is extremely frustrating given how much information he destroys or is shown to be the only keeper of in this episode. It's a huge setup with no payoff. These next 3 choices were really difficult, but coming in at number 9 is episode 10, Full Circle. This episode is a really great example of how this show can be a collection of sound bites or great shots with little cohesiveness in between. The last scene where we see Dee with Benny the Black Shoggoth is wonderfully shot. A bunch of people also pointed out the allusion to Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, and because it's at the end, we're left with a really beautiful shot that has people walk away saying, "Oh yes, that was so profound," while not considering as much what led up to it. Does it make sense that Baby Girl and Benjamin are tromping through the forest all alone right now? Does it make sense to have Dee, who is a child, choke out Cersei Lannister, whom she doesn't even know beyond any info that might have been shared off screen? How is Dee gonna go to school with that arm? Hippolyta didn't get the blueprints to a skin sleeve from Luke Skywalker? Often, questions regarding plot are tossed because the scene is pretty or the acting was strong. By the finale, I didn't have any more energy for that. I was just ripping shit to shreds, dog. I'm not even gonna lie. Also, speaking of Dee, I'm mad that she didn't get to curse out the other 4 adults that let her down. I'm happy that she was able to have that moment with Hippolyta where she talked about being left behind, but your mama is not the only adult that failed you. That's the whole point of episode 8. Speaking of the adults, there's just so much I disliked about this episode. I spent the last 10 to 15 minutes just saying, this is terrible, again and again. But the adults, first of all, it's not lost on me that magic being passed down through Tick's maternal side somehow led to all of his magical ancestors being women. I know someone will be like,
that shit is so profound. We're seeing black women as the backbone as a community once again.
And yeah, that's why it's not that profound. I'm gonna bring this up again when I get to episode 9, but I'm not moved by media that portrays black women as continuously sacrificial. And I think it's kind of, for lack of a better word, given the way that patriarchs are portrayed in this show. Which brings me to the other big thing about this episode, the choices made with the end of characters' story arcs. For all the buildup for Montrose's character, why did he have a total of 8 lines in the finale? When everyone is getting those last few moments in Chicago, why don't we see Montrose with Sammy? Why would Tick write a letter to Montrose and no one else? There's so many questions left for Montrose's character that don't feel like, oh, this is an opening for the next season. It just feels like untied ends for this season, which was not satisfying, to say the least. Tick's death is, it is what it is. It is what it is. I think I was so irritated with what looked like Gia sacrificing herself for him that I couldn't even care. Gia thankfully doesn't die. That's the other thing. Sorry, sidebar to the sidebar. The scene in the hotel had me hot because it felt like Atticus was just spitting game because he wanted as much magical power around as possible. We're family. Boy, if you don't get... I'm glad that the scene with Letty trying the same thing with Ruby had Ruby call her out, because I was like, this all feels rushed and shady. But back to grown folks bullshit. Ruby, girl, they did you so wrong. I'm going to link a review of the finale that talks more about Ruby, but I will say something I was worried about the whole season was that her decision to partner with baby Braithwaite would eventually be used to vilify her character. Not that she'd be actively evil like Christina, but just the idea that you would rather lay up with your white partner than do something for your black family makes you evil. So narratively, the choice to kill her, have Christina make a potion from her blood, and then fight and kill Letty felt like punishment for Ruby. And I hated that shit. Last thing I'll say is that the episode had some horrible music choices and heavy-handed writing, seconded only by choice number 8, which is episode 5, Strange Case. I spent a bit of time unpacking episode 5 in my mid-season review, but illustratively, I think some of the most heavy-handed writing is in this episode. And I don't like that the Ruby-centric episode features so little of her as her. When I first watched this episode, I thought it did a pretty good job of exploring the tension that a lot of black women, arguably all people of color in America, feel in wanting to be something and knowing that trying to achieve that goal will be like squeezing water from a stone. Not because you lack the skill, but because the structure of our country will never make a single thing easy for you, least of all something you want. Episode 5 is the first episode where the source of strife is invisible for the most part. The violence and impact of racism isn't embodied in overzealous cops or mutilated ghosts. It is in and around everything Ruby does and wants. At times, she is a perpetuator of racism. We're shown the internal impact on Ruby through her conversations with William and Christina, or on her own struggles at work. And later in the season, we do have more characters similarly sharing about the internal impacts of racism, with Hippolyta's conversation with Josephine Baker, or Montrose talking to Dee after Emmett's funeral, but this is really the first. That being said, after having some time away from it, I don't think this episode did what it thought it did, or what I thought it did. A lot of the commentary about Ruby's experience felt performative, and for an outsider audience to glean understanding, not for an insider audience to resonate with. Again, Ruby being naked the majority of the time we see her, which isn't much, didn't sit well with me, and her end scene with the manager, beyond feeling very performative for the viewer, further pushes that this episode, and especially this scene, didn't utilize strong storytelling. This is a message for you at home, irrespective of the impact narratively or on this character's development over time. Like I mentioned in my rundown of the season, I don't mind if we switch the structure of the episodes, but I want characters' growth to be steady and realistic. The next episode that I think was really jarring in terms of character development is choice number 7, which is episode 8, Jigabobo. A lot of people complained about episode 6 feeling out of place, but I think episode 8 was a bigger deviation from what we have been presented thus far in regards to how the characters are navigating everything around them. Before getting into the major plot of the episode, we have all this nonsense with the adults, starting with a surprise visit from Gia. When I took notes for this episode, I wrote, I'm going to need her to be more than a tool for Atticus's storyline, because Jamie Chung has already played a character that was completely shafted and she doesn't deserve that again. Oh, child. Anyway, that didn't happen. I also didn't understand why Letty was so mad. Like, maybe this is just a me problem, but I don't understand why so many of the characters were mad about shit that didn't pertain to them. Is it awkward that Gia showed up? Yeah. But clearly Atticus loves Letty right now, and we know this because his parting words to Gia are foul. I don't know if this show knew how it want me to feel about Atticus, or Montrose for that matter, but neither of those motherfuckers were getting much sympathy the longer we were around them. Also in this episode, all the decisions around Christina were trash. Beyond that one really tasteless scene where she pays 2 men to kill her in the same way that Emmett Till was murdered, the idea that these characters who have been so weary to trust her for so long are now extremely desperate and willing to give her valuable shit didn't make sense. Especially because this episode ends with them actually needing Christina's help because of what happens to Dee, and it's like you can't even do that because you wasted all of your leverage on dumb shit. or not dumb shit, but like unnecessarily. We're supposed to piece together that Tick and Letty are moving different because Letty is pregnant, but first of all, how is protecting Tick gonna protect your child when Tick isn't the pregnant one? But also, y'all don't care about the real life child getting cursed by the evil police in the meantime? This is an episode where we're making strong social commentary, in this case about the way the world ignores black girls. While in episode 7, Hippolyta got the chance to confront George and say, you were an active participant in my shrinking, this episode left me questioning if Dee would get a moment to tell the roster of adults in her life, y'all didn't give a shit about me for 12 hours and look what happened. And again, she does get that moment with Hippolyta in episode 10, but I think it was really important, especially given the framing of this episode, that Dee get that chance to confront everyone, and she doesn't, which was whack. As I've mentioned, I think I need to do a whole video cast on character development because I didn't understand why everyone was caring so little about Dee. Montrose's development was particularly irritating. I think he's the most inconsistently written character, but even ignoring his behavior for the rest of the season, in this episode alone, he performs a protection spell on Atticus. Which, how does he know the language of Adam, even if it's written down, and how is he able to use magic if you need a specific bloodline? But anyway, Montrose is cognizant of magic in this episode, we are reminded. So why is a magical element not in consideration when he sees Dee swinging around in the garage? I tried to listen a little bit less to the podcast to not mix my thoughts, but in the podcast for this episode, Shannon voiced that Montrose's talk with Dee at the beginning of the episode is to give her the message to go down swinging. So then why, when he sees Dee swinging, does he decide to restrain her? Or even when Dee is trying to warn Letty, why doesn't Letty give a shit? I know Dee can't tell them exactly what's happening to her, and she later figures out on her own to draw it, but why are these adults who are cognizant of magic ignoring her? I get it, we're making social commentary, but it doesn't make sense for these characters. Even without the magic, it makes even less sense for Letty, given just an episode before we have a scene with her and Ruby where Letty is apologizing for being selfish and not checking up on her sister. So you have a character become aware that a toxic trait they learned from an unreliable adult in their life has had an impact on the way they maintain their relationships, and then you just have her do the same thing. All that being said, I think the horror in this episode is the best. I couldn't sleep after this episode, like deadass. I just stayed up until the sun rose. But visuals aside, I think this episode did a really strong job of carrying the idea of an internal struggle made real as introduced in episode 5 and meshing it with horror tropes, leaning on the strength this show has with playing up genre. We watch Dee struggle with the curse of white interpretation of black girlhood, and while the struggle is invisible to everyone else, the impact on Dee is very much real. The horror of that was thrilling, but it doesn't negate all the other fun action. Moving on. Coming in at number 6 is episode 9, Rewind 1921. This is a kind of meh episode, but Rewind 1921 features 2 major advances in the plot. The return of Hippolyta, who ends the episode with blue hair, and the retrieval of the Book of Names. In my notes, I put this episode as adults too lost in their own shit to give a fuck about their kids part 2, because this episode made me question even more, while neither George nor Dora, according to Atticus, never really stopped Montrose's abuse, and if they cared more about the dynamics of their triad than with what was going on with Atticus his whole childhood. But also, abuse and stopping abuse isn't that clear cut. I concede that. It's just that the only person left alive to provide some type of explanation has to unpack and heal from so much of his own trauma that I'm left with more questions. Another major aspect of this episode was that it mirrored some previous ones. I mentioned earlier that I predicted there would be some repeats from episode 5 and how time was divided among characters, but I also think having Montrose, Tick, and Letty all face the past mirrored episode 2, when Tick, Letty, and George were hallucinating in the manor. We have our patriarchs have to address a lost love and let something go. Letty is shown to have her story revolve around Faith and Atticus, and Tick himself, well, he gets to fight. Speaking of that, saying "I got you, kid" to his father, I know is supposed to be touching, but it also feels draining to think about the child being the support for the parent, since he was even a thought for the parent to have. Or like when Montrose said he gave up everything for the chance to have a boy because men have sons. A lot of people unfortunately have this idea of finding personal redemption and unconditional love through having children. But a child is not replacement for therapy. It's unfair and unhealthy to expect your unfertilized seed to be your salvation. And this is different from being your great-great-grandparents' faith made manifest, but note that the show put these 2 ideas right next to each other. And it's conflicting because we see a lot of the unhealthiness in Tick and Montrose's relationship, but are y'all trying to encourage this or break it down and unpack it? Because it doesn't always feel like we're doing anything with this relationship, but showing how it exists. And in listening to the podcast episodes, I know discussing toxic parental relationships is meant to be a really big running motif, but I feel exhausted for Tick, and somewhat like we're burning rubber on the same aspects of their dynamic instead of getting any further with conversations about the impact this dynamic has and how you grow past it. The last thing I'll say about this episode, and is in part why it's rated where it's at, is that we see multiple women sacrificing themselves. And to come right off of back-to-back episodes about giving Black women and girls the space to be seen, heard, and loved, it doesn't feel touching to watch great-grandmama Freeman burn to death. By the way, she's my favorite character from this episode, and we don't even know her name. We watch Dora throw herself in front of Montrose, we watch Hippolyta push herself to the extreme, but we don't see Hippolyta display any emotion in reaction to Dee being in a coma. She is immediately rational and action-oriented. I want to see Hippolyta curse somebody out. I think an interesting contrast to this dynamic of the serene, composed, self-sacrificing Black woman is the scene with Ruby earlier when she's getting ready to leave with Christina and Letty tries to stop her. Ruby essentially says, "This white lady has never harmed me," which, child... Ruby essentially says, "This white lady has never harmed me." Meanwhile, those 2 knuckleheads you're hanging out with are volatile as fuck. And I don't know how intentional this was, but to me, it connects to modern conversations about interracial dating and the idea of going where you're loved instead of staying in partnerships or investing in potential partnerships where you may be unsatisfied or harmed, but you are at least with another Black person. Now, Do I want Christina to be the person with whom Ruby feels loved and safe? No, not really. But the point is that Black womanhood often comes with a heavy expectation of sacrifice. And it was interesting that in an episode that featured so much of that, the one scene we get of a Black woman caring for and protecting herself is Ruby choosing to go with Christina instead of staying with Letty. Given how Ruby's story ends out, that clearly was not a good choice. But regardless, I could have done with less imagery of Black women literally putting their bodies in danger for other people. Portraying Black women as strong at the detriment to our own livelihood and to the detriment of us also being seen as whole humans is whack, even if that imagery is pushed by other Black women. I didn't mention this when initially recording, but it is important to note that the writers made the decision to add a violent traumatic event into Montrose's past when seeking to provide more depth to his sexuality and the way that he views his sexuality and the harm that is inherent in that decision. Coming in at number 5 is episode 2, Whitey's on the Moon. This episode introduced our bigger questions for the season. Now that the road trip has been completed, what are we going to be worrying about? The white supremacist wizards. Whitey's on the Moon also sets up a lot in terms of dynamics. We lose Uncle George, we meet Montrose, William, and Christina, we see Atticus fighting with Gia. All of this will be important for the rest of the season. But the episode, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just meh. I will say this is ranked a little further down because there is a huge plot hole that's not resolved, which is why was Montrose digging into the Sons of Adam stuff to begin with? In the book, Papa Braithwaite spells Montrose into both writing the letter and coming to Artem so that Atticus will follow and his body can be used for the spell. But in the show, Montrose just yells at Tick for being stupid enough to follow him. Given that this kickstarts literally the whole show, it's really unsatisfying that we don't know why Montrose ended up here and that it isn't a consistent question throughout the show. Not that we needed to know at the end of this episode, but that's never really fulfilled or answered. I think what I like most about episode 2, however, is also true of episode 9, which is the potential setup in the plot. However, I think episode 2 had more that was actualized, and not just because there was more narrative time, but because the writers actually followed the threads of consequence in George's death, in meeting Christina and William, in seeing how Atticus perceives Gia and how Letty perceives him, while in episode 9, the act of most and only importance that is followed up in the finale is Letty's side story with the Book of Names and Hippolyta's return, which take up the least amount of time. Coming in at number 4 is episode 1, Sundown. So I normally don't like pilots. Like if I'm rewatching a show, I will always skip the first episode because they feel too slow once you know everything. But I think Sundown did a really good job of introducing us to the complexities of this universe. The list of things that go bump in the night is long. The pilot also introduces the motif of loving flawed stories and people, which is kind of hilarious given all my criticisms of the show. But I also really enjoy the magical realist type of episodes, I guess you could say, of where everything kind of seems normal, but there's something that's a little off. So I love that this was how we started off the series. And in addition to setting up the complexities of the universe, I do think it does a really good job of drawing us into these characters and their story, you know, even if the way everything plays out isn't how we would like. Coming in at number 3 is episode 3, Holy Ghost, aka The Haunted Mansion, aka The Tower of Terror. Beyond the phenomenal acting in this episode, Holy Ghost does a great job of introducing several plot points to call back to, the most important being the priestess blessing the doorway. But this is also where we learn of the orrery, Dr. Frankenstein's plans to build a portal to the Megaverse, the tunnels under Letty's house, Emmett Till asking the Ouija board about his trip. There's a lot of great planting in this episode. Holy Ghost also has Tick and Letty's relationship shift, and I know a lot of people were like, this feels random, but as someone who talks a lot of junk and starts a decent amount of shit when they're drunk, it made perfect sense to me. But for real, I liked the buildup of tension and thought the explosion, literally, was done well. I wish we had more of that buildup through seeing shifts in their behavior throughout episodes. There's 2 episodes where they're doing research and Letty is held by Tick or is holding Tick. I wanted to see more of that, more of how their relationship is progressing and how they treat each other beyond these big, physically intimate moments. A big question mark I had for this show was how much time is progressing, especially as it pertains to romantic relationships. And I think building up small cues throughout, like in the beginning of episode 8 when Tick is being really henpecky because he knows Letty is pregnant, would have helped with that. I will say that this episode does help with the progression of time a little bit because Letty mentions 2 or 3 weeks have passed since George's funeral. I mentioned this earlier, but I think the shift between the first 3 episodes, and specifically from episode 2 to 3, has the best continuous character progression over the season. And something that helps with that is knowing, oh, it's been 3 weeks since y'all last saw each other. This episode shows that there can be time jumps without losing a sense of character progression. Coming in at number 2 is episode 6, Meet Me in Daegu. I loved episode 6. I love the acting, the cinematography, the outfits. I think it's some of the best writing in the season in terms of character development with how we see Gia progress over the episode. It also has some of the best music selections in the show. I already ran through my feelings about the anachronistic music choices in other episodes, but in Meet Me in Daegu, there's never really an out-of-place music choice, which is a rarity. Episode 6 just feels so different, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think that helps with the feeling of being transported somewhere else. But all of that is not to say that this episode is without faults. There was some weird comparisons with communism and being gay with Youngja, specifically her monologue on they want us to feel bad for who we are, but there's nothing wrong with being different. I was like, that's some gay shit. Which was, like, I'm not saying that's some gay shit to say that that's bad, but rather I don't like the way this show handles sexuality. And I think to have this conversation where the phrasing used for having a different political identity or being, a demon in a human's body sounds very similar to the phrasing used for, like, the fucking It Gets Better project. That felt weird. I didn't like that. I was like, should took that to the writing center, get that workshopped. Anyway, I would have loved if this episode could have built more on how magic works in the world as we learned about Kumihos. And especially because we see the shaman woman at the end. It's like, okay, clearly we're building up that there's multiple different ways that magic exists. Can we talk a little bit more about that? I think that also would have helped with my questions about, like, how can Montrose work a spell if he isn't of the bloodline? How can Letty have all of this magical prowess beyond being pregnant, But back to this episode, I think the pacing in Meet Me in Daegu could have been better. It felt both really slow and also extremely fast in regards to how Gia and Atticus's relationship progressed. The time cards they had of showing us, like, what season and year it was, the whole episode takes place over, like, 6 months, which doesn't feel like enough time for everything that happens, but also the build-up was really slow. So yeah, the pacing was just kind of funky. Speaking of Atticus, however, I think this episode did a strong job of setting up a tension that was not carried out for the rest of the season, unfortunately, in how we see Atticus and protagonists in general. When he first pops up in this episode, it's to commit a war crime. When we see him next, he's closer to the Atticus we have known so far, and it's uncomfortable to try and match up that Atticus with the war criminal that we see in the beginning. But I don't think that this episode or the rest of the season does a good job of easing that tension. I believe that Atticus needed to atone specifically to the people in his life who were impacted by the murder he committed. I would have liked to see that. I would have liked to see more of how are Gia and Atticus addressing this tension. How are they growing to the point of believing that we have a choice in being monsters or being heroes, instead of just Gia giving Atticus that forgiveness and us being expected to believe that it happened off screen. Coming in at number 1 is episode 7, I Am. There was something so unadulterated, so not intended for white consumption about Hippolyta's journey of self, especially her conversation with Josephine Baker. Hippolyta was allowed to show an expression of rage instead of an explanation of it. Going back to Ruby in episode 5, so much of her storyline is entangled with Christina and William, and as a result, she can feel like a character who is put in a story for white comfort.
But she's dark-skinned and plus-size. She'd be the most marginalized.
That's maybe even more so why she is the character to ride the Alaskan bullworm and warm over the frozen heart of the ever-present white devil. But again, character development video cast. My point here is rather that Ruby's rage can feel tempered or like it's serving an educational purpose. But Hippolyta wasn't no sugarcoating this shit. And that was so much more enjoyable. One last comparison point. On the Lovecraft Radio podcast, the co-hosts had described Ruby as the character who is most unapologetically herself. And I don't think that's true at all. I think she may be the most outwardly confident character, but the whole point of her episode is all about how she can't be her in order to be herself, and how much she feels bogged down by that. I think if anyone, it's Dee who's most genuine, and so much of that is seemingly connected to her youth and thus being temporary. But up to this point, for me, Hippolyta always seemed like the character who was wholly, truly herself, in her anger and confusion about George's death, in her love about space, even after attempts to kind of dull that shine. But this episode yanked at my perception of her. I already thought Hippolyta was huge in her own quiet way, but this episode pushed us all to ask how much bigger could she be if she wasn't forced to shrink herself? How much could all Black women expand if we weren't told to make ourselves small? The possibilities are as infinite as the multiverse itself, and I love that shit. I'm getting chills thinking about it right now. I just love this episode. The emotional pull of this episode was strong enough for me to forgive Humanoid Garnet's tacky-ass name. It's just, if you watch nothing else, just watch this episode. And I very much think you could watch it without knowing, anything else from the plot and be decently okay. It's so good. It's so good. I love this episode. Chef's kiss. There you have it. I feel like Tipsy Bartender. There you have it! Lovecraft Country Season 1, from worst to best. I'm really driven by character development in the media I watch, so even if there was some strong social commentary in there, if the plot doesn't make sense for the progression of the characters, I'm gonna be irritated. As I've mentioned multiple times, I could dig more into the character development on its own, because I think even with the funky special effects and the anachronistic music and the heavy-handed social commentary writing, if the character development had been stronger, I would have been willing to look past so many flaws. Instead, I had to greatly shift my expectations for this show as it went on. It wasn't always clear which plot pieces would be important until they were picked up again later, and while that led to some strong payoff for some planting, it left pretty noticeable plot holes elsewhere. I think the direction made with a lot of the characters' arcs could have been so much stronger, even within a 10-episode time span. I won't say I'm disappointed, but I'm not as impressed as I was when the show first started. I've seen a lot of people saying all Black television doesn't have to be good, that Lovecraft Country specifically doesn't have to be excellent to be worth its screen time. And mediocre Black art deserves space too, but that doesn't mean that it's free of criticism, especially for a show that does want us to dive deep, to read into certain messaging. It's totally fair to dissect other portions of the narrative that aren't consistent, that don't make sense, that are intentionally harmful. All this being said, a lot of people did really enjoy the ham-fisted social commentary and phenomenal acting, so this show will likely get a season 2 if, Miss Rona allows. I wouldn't be surprised if Journey Smollett and Michael K. Williams get Emmy noms, which they would deserve. But watching a whole other season of this show, I'd let a few episodes go by before checking it out. This show could be stronger if they spent more time connecting dots and working within the range that they do have. But whether or not the writer's room would make that kind of adjustment would take a bit of narrative time to show. With the season we do have, there are some gems story-wise, a lot of well-done visuals, and great use of horror tropes. If that's enough for you, Lovecraft Country is worth the view. If you're easily irritated by plot holes and flat characters, though, I suggest watching it with a glass of wine and all the lights turned on. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. Yeah, like I said, this was multiple weeks in the making. I hope it's cohesive. Girl, it's gonna take me forever to edit this. If you made it to the end, I truly appreciate you because this was a lot of work. Now that this isn't on TV anymore, I don't know what I'm gonna watch next, girl. Leave any suggestions in the comments below. Yeah, my next video cast is as much a surprise to you as it is to me. Until then, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.